have a question about your cunt that you were too embarrassed to pose? Like, if I don't have sex for the next 8 years, will my pussy hole close? Well, buckle up, school's in session. These sex pros have planned a lesson, 'cause cunts aren't just for reproduction. Whether you were born with it or it's under construction, open your ears, 'cause the Clam Jam's got you covered. The Clam Jam.
Hello and welcome to the Clam Jam. I think we are rolling. We're live. Everything's going well. We're doing it again. This is week 2. And today is October 30th, and it's October, and obviously that means it's spooky season. Tomorrow is Halloween, and I thought what would be super appropriate for our second episode would be talking about horror and feminism and gender. So our guest today is Maggie Mayhem, and I'll be bringing her on in just a moment. Real quick, if you are watching this live, feel free to post questions in the comments. We will get to those probably at the end. We're interested in hearing what you have to say as well. If you are watching this in the future and you're watching the replay and you want to join the live stream, please do. We will be posting the link to the live stream in my Patreon, the Consultant Patreon. If you join at the Cunts United level, you have access to the full live stream. If you're at any level, if you're a patron at any level, you have access to our full catalog. But if you want to be part of the live stream, it's Cunts United, which is really fun to say. And then you have full license to just say cunt whenever you want. So there's the fun part of that. No obligation, come in, come out, join us. So with all that said, I just want to also shout out my necklace because, again, witchy shit. This is made by Corinne Loper-Fido of Pussy Powerhouse fame and just, being a general badass. She's fantastic. I love this necklace. I love wearing it as much as I can. So with all that being said, I want to bring on Maggie. And let me just give you a tiny little bio about Maggie, who is wildly accomplished. And here are just a few of the things about her. So Maggie Mayhem is a former sex worker, full spectrum gestational worker, and a home funeral guide based in San Francisco, California. She has been involved in harm reduction since 2003 and believes in the power of pursuing any positive change. She has appeared at South by Southwest, DEF CON, UN Internet Governance Forum, Center for Democracy and Technology, and universities around the globe advocating for sex worker rights. Her hobbies include running marathons, beekeeping, embroidery, and playing with dinosaurs on the floor with her feisty toddler. You can follow her on Twitter at Ms. Maggie Mayhem or on Instagram at Maggie Mayhem or her website, maggiemayhem.com. She is not on Facebook. Do not go on Facebook. You will not find her there. So with all that being said, Maggie, welcome. Look at this blood splatter.
Yeah, we're getting spooky because my house is spookier than blood spatter right now, doing the parenting during a pandemic.
That is such a real thing. Oh my God, parenting during a pandemic. Lord, I am not a parent, but I am partnered with a parent and he is doing that and I'm watching it unfold. So good job, you. But I love it. I love the hat. Everything you have going on is so great. So as you know, and as people might know as well, one, I've been following you for years and just like a very big fan of all the work you're doing. I am such a fan of sex workers and I'm such a fan of people who are sex worker advocates and activists. That makes me very happy and I love it. But the reason you're here today is because you started doing this fabulous challenge this month called hashtag 31 Days of Halloween, where you're talking about, you're doing these like fantastic little outfits and setups of different classic and very culty horror films, and then like giving a caption, and it's like the images are great and then your captions are just incredible. And I want you to talk about it, but this is me, like my experience of it, just being like, wow, this Maggie is delivering like some serious knowledge on like feminist gender critique of horror movies while being like a super horror fan. I am not a horror fan. I have seen several of the horror movies of the genre. So I can keep up with some of it, but I have always been so into symbolism and into like, you know, picking apart something like what is the artistic choice here? What does it mean beyond the literal? So I'm just really excited to talk to you more about it and hear more of your terrifyingly brilliant brain. So
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That was such a generous welcome, and it's exciting to be here. I love the name of it. I love being able to say cunt as often as possible. I think it's an important word. It's one that I love to grab and say. It's a word that has teeth, and I'm not afraid to bear them. So digging it all the way. And yeah, but it was a fun project, and it was a project because this pandemic has definitely gotten me into a creative rut. If my witch hat flies away, it's because of the magic of Halloween spirit. But that was the kind of spirit I needed to latch onto, because it's been a really, really, really just hard time for everybody. The news every day is bad. It's hard to live in a pandemic, and you know, I'm no longer postpartum. It's been a while since I gave birth. My child's about to turn 19 months, but I still hadn't really gotten over that postpartum creative hump, you know, where I really hadn't come back to creating art or writing. And I knew that that was a final step for me coming out of that period of motherhood, that I really needed to come back into my creative own. And that was hard to do when the world blew up. Really hard time to get my bearings. And I couldn't do it. And I needed just a cheesy gimmick that would force me to get up and just do it, even if it wasn't perfect, even if it wasn't everything I wanted it to be. And even though I have missed days, I really wanted to get 31 days, but sometimes it just didn't happen. But when I missed days, I wanted to get back up and do it again and not abandon it because sometimes I didn't have enough daylight, or sometimes the day schedule needed different things from me.
Well, you did a great job. And again, I feel like even if you didn't hit every single day, this is a quality, not quantity situation as far as I'm concerned. You did it within the confines of 31 days. You did it. You nailed it.
Yeah, and and I still have one more day. But it was completely self-done. There's no hidden photographer. These are all timer, remote shutter photos that I did. So all of the poses are about how I could hide a shutter. A lot of photos went into it because I think most of them are just horrible misfires.
That's the creative process.
The creative process.
Yeah. No, and that reminds me of, and now her name is escaping me, but when I was a younger person and selfies weren't as readily available, like taking self-portraits, I was very into that. So again, like the whole setup, and anyone who's watching this needs to go to Maggie's Instagram and check out this whole shebang. But they're wonderful, and you really did an excellent job of capturing the vibe of these movies with like limited resources, which I honestly, having some confines, I think does make you more creative sometimes.
It can, and also it was, you know, a reminder that I'm really inspired by people who can do the fabulous makeup. You know, when I looked at the hashtag and I could see people just blow my mind. I mean, that is alchemy, and understanding how light hits the face and understanding the art and the prosthetics. I can barely put my eyeliner on straight. So I have no makeup game. That was not going to work. So I knew that just something very basic, but I do have a lot of costume pieces, especially from my performing days. So I have some fun things to wear, and I could hint at an idea and just, start in many ways, like the basic effects that you see in a lot of horror films. I think, a lot of us have a soft spot for bad horror effects. When the monster's really not scary, but trying its best, A for effort. I love A for effort monsters. And I think I kind of reflected that a little bit with my cheesy gimmicks, or relying on extreme filters to compensate for not having lights, trying to shoot when my kid was asleep and it was not a good time for sunlight. And I'll just crank up the saturation. It's fine. The whole point was get up, create with what you have right now. And I gave myself about an hour a day was what I would do with it.
And I think you nailed it. And it just like to the whole point of, I think where everyone's at this moment, just acknowledging still in the midst of a pandemic. But that idea of just like doing things and not making it perfect. And here we are on live, and who knows what the hell is going to happen. But to that, just make it happen and stop being in the perfection of it all. But to your point, and I also want to talk about your film background. to your point, like a lot of these horror movies that we know and love, you know, you go back and look at them and they just have really low budget effects, which is both like makes it, I think, for maybe myself being like, oh, well, it's like a little cheesy, so I'm a little less like completely disturbed versus like newer horror movies where you're like, you really got it nailed down on like the blood and the gore, and it's like I can't be there. But that being said, like the horror of the mundane, and one of my like I definitely, there's some horror that I can engage with and I enjoy. And probably like David Lynch is an excellent example of that.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in a household where like Twin Peaks, we had very limited TV, and Twin Peaks played a really big role in my childhood. And anyone who knows me well, like knows that's a big part of my own personal mythology. But so much of that, it's like there are definitely some like horror moments, like more like jump scares in there. But a lot of it is just like the horror of being alive and the horror of having a body or not having control of your body or not having control of your mind, or, you know, things that go bump in the night. Yes. And, you know, like low budget or like not, you know, I think maybe that's dismissive sometimes, but just have like using what you've got can just be as scary as anything else.
Absolutely. Well, when you catch the feeling, because horror is a genre of feeling. The only way you can start to write horror is you really have to start with that first person question of I feel horrified by. And that's why I think feminist horror is really important, because it's important when we look at different forms of marginalization to be able to identify those feelings of fear and those feelings of horror from that kind of a first person place. And that's also, you know, I think we're seeing all kinds of a renaissance in horror genres. Horror has been a really traditionally white genre. It's been produced by white studios, driven by, you know, just whiteness at all possible angle. And the question is why? And I think that's because studios and white studios and white audiences have been too afraid to confront what marginalized people, what Black, Indigenous people of color might say when they answer the question, I am horrified by. And so I think we're going to continue to see so much, just, we haven't seen anything from the horror genre yet. I think it's going to blossom because there's so much to talk about in that feeling, so much to explore. So it's why I get excited by it. And it's why I like doing gender-based analysis of horror films as well, because we get to explore what those bumps are. But like, you know, as a genre, in terms of watching it, it has so much in common with porn. And I think especially when you say there's some kinds of horror I can watch and some that I can't, I can immediately make a parallel to like gonzo porn versus plot-based porn, or like you have porn directors that you know are going to deliver a story or a, you know, an experience that you can get behind, versus sometimes the gonzo really is like the torture porn. Like it's shot like, you know, they share very similar camera perspectives and they can be just too gratuitously confrontational for some people. But there's room for that. You know, the genre is bigger than just gonzo, and horror is bigger than just hostile or torture porn, for sure.
Yeah. And I think there's, you know, even we like, of course, like when I think we think of like porn and horror overlapping, right? It would be like the gonzo stuff. It'd be more like torture, like more extreme BDSM. I don't know if you ever watched the Hump Film Fest, like Dan Savage's Hump Film Fest, but there was one, I think this year, which was like, it was like fun to watch, but you're like, I don't know how to feel afterwards. Which is like the whole point of Hump. But there's like, what's horrifying for one person might not be horrifying for another person. And I think that's exactly when it comes to horror movies, myself being like, I don't get why people want to like go be terrified. Like I've never watched Hostel. I don't want to ever watch it. I want nothing to do with Saw. But some people, like people obviously love that. And I, you know, like when we talk about these like cathartic feelings, or what is this bringing up on, like, what is the feeling behind it? And why do we want to tap into that feeling? I think is really an interesting question in all these ways. Like it's both porn and horror are exhibiting a body response, right? It's like both, it's mental, but it's like, how do you feel it versus, I don't know, like something that's more like a cerebral documentary, or I don't know. I think everything could elicit a body response, but there is definitely a connection there. And you have a background as a filmmaker. with like
a
an
little
adult filmmaker.
Yeah, I would definitely be considered like the lowest budget of the lowest budget. Doing queer and feminist porn film work definitely is so much like doing horror industrial, genre work as well, where you're getting together with people who are doing the best they can with low resources. So a lot of the queer, the feminist horror, or horror porn canon definitely have the shaky cam, have our own lighting mishaps or sound mishaps, but sometimes there's so much camaraderie in that because you're collaborating with people as best you can and you're getting to know them, and there is a sense of community. And so sometimes I think our camaraderie spoke louder than maybe some of the practical parts were, and that's why it could be fun and charming for audiences, or why we could have such a relationship with the people who enjoyed watching those films, because those relationships were transcendent. It's incredible the fact that there are people that have been in contact with the work that I've made and been in contact with me as viewers for a long time now. And they've watched me grow up and I've watched them grow up, and it's all through this weird medium of sexuality. And I think horror people have that kind of a relationship with their audience too, in that it's very intimate. It's very intimate if you keep showing up and watching it.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. I'm thinking about like the designation of what makes a cult film, right? And so usually I think cult is like a loving term for a shitty movie, is like kind of how we talk about it. And it depends, like different levels, right? There are certain films that are like really very good, they just didn't have wide appeal, and other films are like it's like so bad it's good, like The Room as one example. So there's that in there. But with that, let's like segue into the critique. So, and I'm sure again, I think it's really interesting. Like, I think we'll just keep coming back to sex throughout this as well, because obviously. But so how did you get started with, it seems, I mean, talk about your relationship with horror. It seems like you grew up being a horror fan. And then I wonder at what point you also started to apply like a feminist, gender literate, queer perspective to it.
Yeah. Oh goodness. My first memories of horror were the video rental store in my small town. And so I'm already dated. There were these things, they were in boxes, they were very big, and they had tape, and they went in a VCR.
Oh yeah. Do you remember, was yours in like the back room of someone else's house? Because that's what mine was. Like, we were in a small town, and it was like they lived in one half of the house, and the back of the house was the video.
The combo house businesses were definitely a thing in our small town, but this one was like attached to the ice cream store, so it was the double business. That was the other option to maximize your real estate, so you could get your ice cream and then go get your movie for the night. But I was not allowed to like rent horror films, but I would just wander through the store, and my eye was always very attracted to the horror section, especially when you think of the advertising going on with the VHS tape. Like the pulp fiction mid-century paperbacks didn't die; they evolved, and they became the movie posters, and they became the VHS covers. And we didn't, there was no internet. You didn't get to, do a lot of research on movies. You could look at what the newspaper reviewers or critics would say, but a lot of people were making movie choices based on what box spoke to them and why. And the horror boxes to me were just so eye-catching. They always had these just big, exciting fonts, and they had just, I thought, very creative monsters. And so I spent all my time in the horror section. And the funny part is I was short. I'm a kid. And so I still remember the way the stacks were organized, like alphabetically, so they'd have all the A's. And I have a really good memory of 80s and 90s horror, but I'm missing entire sections in my memories of letters that were at the top beyond my reach. Like, I don't really know a lot of the A kind of horror, and just, certain J's, I don't know. All just from the stacks and my experience of being little in a big kid and adult section.
Yeah.
So that was my real first introduction to horror. And then being told I couldn't watch it, of course, made it the more attractive. So I had to look into that. And then it just became a genre I enjoyed. I lived in a small town in Los Angeles County. So my small town actually was what Hollywood used as its setting and its context for small town America.
Oh,
Because
wow.
they couldn't get out to the Midwest. So I grew up in what is basically like Horror Film USA. It has the most horror films shot in it per capita than any other city in America. So Laura Palmer was buried not in Twin Peaks. Laura Palmer's cemetery is actually where I grew up. She was buried in this.
Whoa.
That's where they shot it. It's a very small cemetery. That's my hometown.
The iconic that scene.
That scene with the lowering of Leland Palmer and that projection. Oh my God, that's a very intense scene. In an otherwise upbeat, light TV series. So I was around a lot of movie crews. So in general, I was aware of the artifice of cinema just as a fact of life. Film crews were these people who would come and they would take over our baseball park. They would take over our cemetery. They would take over the library. And because we were quaint and they were Hollywood, there was these power relationships. But I was always aware that, you know, how everything in a movie was fake. And that made me love it more. I loved that the blood was fake, that there was an artist who had to make the blood look right. And that was their job. And, you know, that actress, even though she's screaming her head off, she's fine. She's eating pizza a minute later. And that helped me put horror in context. You know, like I always knew it was a creation, that it was an artifice. I was aware of the materiality of the storytelling. And so from there, you know, I kind of was able to start appreciating and pulling apart the stories that were being told. Yeah, it was easier. I could easily not get lost, I think, the same way. It didn't have the same. I was under its spell, but in a very different way.
But you weren't like this, you weren't entering into horror films in the way of like, oh my God, this is a documentary about someone's lived experience, which again, porn parallel, right? So like oftentimes, you know, a lot of the critique, I think, or not critique, but like full on criticism of porn is that this is our children's sex education, which is not porn's fault. That is the failing of our educational system. But same thing, like if porn is entertainment, horror is entertainment, you should not take these things like in this exact way into your daily life, because there's a lot of crap that goes behind the scenes. These people are professionals, they are artists.
Your teenagers are watching Fast and the Furious too. Is that driver's ed?
Exactly. So that's like your start. So you're like behind the scenes, you're in front of, you're a viewer and a voyeur, kind of, right? Like in both ways. You're like watching this happening and then you're a viewer.
Yes. I was able to like, you know, peer through the peephole and see the people making the movie and peek behind the curtain a little bit, but also not be, you know, have any power, you know, like they wanted to shoot a movie. And so that meant we didn't get our playground today.
Right. Yeah.
You know, because someone else's entertainment was more funded, obviously, than it was for us. So there was also, you know, a little bit of a resentment and, you know, an in-group, out-group that Hollywood needed to use our space. And so that meant we got no parking and we didn't get to use our public spaces. And so always having that sense, too, of film crews come in and act like they can do whatever they want in your hometown.
Yeah, which I think also like in a way plays into horror, right? Like you're out of control, or there's like something that's outside of your control. So you have this background, you grew up in this space, and then at what point you're just enjoying horror in some capacity, and then when do you start to like get more of a lens? Like I know in part of your series you recommended or you showcased a bunch of different books, like Men, Women, and Chainsaws. Is that what it was called?
Yes.
Like I love that title.
Yes.
And so, I mean, again, like as just a very, very casual viewer of the occasional horror movie when, you know, a boyfriend roped me into it, I'm aware of like the basic tropes, right? Of like most slasher films are just like meditations on sexual frustration and puritanical doctrine for teenagers. So you are, you know, that's why like the teenagers who are having sex die first and the virgin lives till the end, right? So like basic things like that. And so being aware and usually it's like the woman, right? It's the woman being punished for sex. It's the female like femme presenting character being punished for sex. And also I would say like the gay character, like anything that's not super masculine, or not super white either in any of those camps, like the other. So those tropes, I think some of us are familiar with, but obviously those come out of an entire like body of work that many academics and people who think things have put together. So what was your introduction to critique, like gendered feminist critique of horror?
I think some of the first time I really got into it formally was in college, and it was in a literature class that focused on horror. And the interesting thing is that it was a very white male professor, and it was interesting what he picked on his syllabus, and then, what was really missing. And it was interesting to be taught the idea of the final girl, and to just, I disagreed with the analysis. It was, it was like when like the way orgasm, as a narrative arc gets explained back to you, which is another very interesting. Yeah, well, just even the idea of the climax cycle.
Yeah. Can you do the final girl and climax, like connect those two? But in case, I think I'm familiar with what the final girl theory is, but if you want to just like give it in a moment.
Yeah. The final girl was proposed by an academic, Carol Clover, and she was watching horror, and she noticed this pattern coming up over and over again where they're, for whatever the bad guy is or wherever they come from, if they're supernatural or if they're a human bad guy, a boogeyman of some sort, that they're going to go through a field of victims, and there is going to be a defining characteristic that kind of makes them homogenous, but there will be someone in that social group who has something that makes them different, something that makes them a survivor of the boogeyman. And what is the quality that makes them distinct and gives them a different perspective on the situation that they're facing? Why are they able to identify evil in their midst when other people maybe don't know there's even anything dangerous going on? The thing that makes them othered usually is the thing that makes them the hero in the end. And that's a very, traditional kind of arc. That's a Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer arc in many ways. We could say Rudolph is the final girl of that foggy night on Christmas. That's the final girl, really. We put a lot of that is going to be racialized. That is going to be, it's going to have gender is going to be thrown at it. Class is going to be thrown at it. All these issues come up because we're making judgments about society and how we interact. So it's interesting to see how different people take that kind of a framework and run with it, and what they think those characteristics are, or why is it that so many different filmmakers of so many different budgets can come up with a lot of similar things, is also very interesting and very revelatory of a lot of just things that are going on with society. Horror is the best psychoanalytic lens of society at any moment. So
yeah, I think that's thinking about, I remember when I was first being introduced maybe to these concepts, zombie movies were a really big deal. So I had a friend, and this was probably in high school, so mid 2000s or early aughts, and talking about why are we having all this renaissance of zombie movies? I don't know if I have a good answer, perhaps you do, but what's going on in the culture, what are we afraid of? And to your point also, I think one of what we're seeing as more people are given more options to create things, a lot of horror movies being created about racial concepts that aren't about, white people afraid of black people. It's black people being afraid of white people, or, I have yet to watch Get Out because I'm afraid, but, concepts like that.
Yeah. No. And that kicks open the door to, again, say, I am horrified by what in our society. And the zombie thing was definitely that was a moment. And it was reflected on so many levels. It wasn't just the horror films, people were doing zombie flash mobs, and zombies were making appearances in all forms of, media. And, it's always interesting when you find that happening. One of the posts I did was on aerobics, and aerobics were a moment in all of the 80s films. Back to the Future does kind of a cutaway, just a background shot of the aerobics that are in the old diner, to show you that it's not a 1950 style diner anymore because it's the 80s. So it's an aerobics studio. And, many movies were referencing that. And just that happened with zombies too. The zombies left horror and they entered McDonald's stuff and all of mainstream media. So that's kind of cool that they did that too, considering what they represent.
So what were we afraid of at that moment that was causing all of this zombieism to emerge? Do you have Do you have a theory?
I have some thoughts in many ways that it was like, I think the fear of becoming, the part of like in many ways the fear of the hive brain, but even like you're not even like a hive brain when you're a zombie. You're just part of a brainless need to consume. And so the consumerism is usually what zombies represent, or what George Romero would say. But when I look back to even just the first Night of the Living Dead and what a powerful movie that was, in terms of the fear and anxiety, and even like the central character, who is a man of color, who is the only one who's able to keep his head together through everything that's going on, and he's leading people away from the zombies. And I don't want to spoil the end, but it captures such a powerful moment in what it does. But that was about, the homogenized mass being able to make decisions about themselves, and becoming only capable of consumption, no longer capable of creation, no longer even able to create or maintain life. They're able to reproduce, but they're not creating. They're only adding.
And they're reproducing from things that already exist, right? To be a zombie, you have to like exist as a human being or some kind of living organism first. Yes. And then you're converted. Yeah. So interesting. Yeah. So,
but like different people started to take the zombie to mean different things. And, even like in this one moment politically, people have been pointing out, Mitch McConnell, would he be the kind of person who would hide the zombie bite and the impending infection?
Right.
So even though the zombie's not as trendy, the zombie is still part of our cultural literacy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, like this moment in time, for one of the things we've been watching Watchmen, the HBO TV series that they made. And that in a lot of ways is, it's horrifying. I don't think it falls in the category of horror specifically, but there's certain, it was made last year, but there's certain things about like wearing masks and like people hiding their identities and their politics in these different ways. And like, I was like, oh, it's so prescient. But these are I think the things, oftentimes when we review history, it's like what we're going through now, we have gone through at different times. History repeats itself. So
history does repeat itself.
Yeah.
And horror, horror repeats itself because we're continuing, like we're always being horrified. And, and that was like also as I did this series, because I was doing selfies, that was already a limitation on creation. And I was like, how do I talk about these observations when I'm fundamentally doing a selfie project? And, what films can I talk about, and how can I talk about them effectively from talking points that I have a strong sense of security with, to engage with? Because I think horror is like, because it is such a personal, like a feeling of horror is so personal. So I was really looking at a lot of other theorists, and one person who stood out that I have to do a shout out to absolutely, is someone who is a PhD candidate right now, and who I think needs a book series, Netflix deal, the whole 9 yards. And that is Zalika Ibarimi, who did a webinar called Holy Ontologies. And she focuses on horror, she focuses on porn, and her scholarship on this stuff right now is blowing my mind. So if that's something that you're interested in, I will not do it justice, but you need to find this webinar, and you need to keep your eye on this scholar, because Zalika is just incredible. She is incredible. Wow. And that the Holy Ontologies webinar was amazing.
So definitely let's share that after this. I'll get the link from you, and we'll share that with this. So with that, I guess, like, especially with this idea, I keep talking about it as feminism, but we really mean like gender politics. So I'm curious to go back to your professor who introduced you to the idea of the final girl, and then also with this orgasm arc. I want to go back to that. And then I want to go into the idea of like body horror. And I think body horror is, again, something that is like always prevalent, always present with us. If we go back and look at like myths, I think it's like, I was thinking the other day about the myth of the seven, or I don't know how to say it, but like the seven sisters, I think that's it, right? The constellation. And I'm going to butcher this, but it's a Native American myth, and how we get the Big Dipper, I believe, right? And the idea, it's the Big Dipper, and then it's this rock formation. I'm totally destroying this. People are watching this and yelling. But basically, part of the story is like there's these 8 siblings that are playing. It's these 7 sisters and their brother. And at some point, the boy is pretending to be a bear. And at some point, he turns into a bear and starts chasing his sisters. And they climb up onto this tree trunk that then grows to help them, and they become stars. But I was just like thinking about that in, you have many myths of your body being out of your control in some way and either causing you or other people harm. And that's a theme that we see repeated. And so I have some other thoughts on that. And I'm kind of going in a bunch of different directions at once, but I am interested to go in that direction right now.
Yeah.
And
well, I love because I think the narrative arc kind of following our arousal cycle makes sense, because a film, is so much about our like creating a sense of arousal, not always sexual arousal, but you become receptive. You watch it and you go into a narrative structure. So you allow yourself to go into a world. And we have this idea that's, usually written about from a very like traditionally cis male perspective, that you have a character and you meet them at the start of a story. They have a call to adventure and like crazy wild stuff happens. Ooh, and they conquer it, and it's very hard, but they overcome it with the help of their friends, and they reintegrate into society as, a wiser, more mature person. Either they've come of age or they've come of age, or, they've, hit another point of development. And it's usually done with just kind of that up, down, boom. And there was so much feminist scholarship that said, well, wait a minute, there's more than one arousal cycle. It's not, first of all, this is not the only one. And this is not how just even like all men experience arousal. This is one form of arousal. And, there's also, ones that kind of go up and they go down and go, oh, they, and just go all over the place. And taking that and looking at the orgasm cycle is a really good way to inform what a storytelling experience should be. And, are you going to have one orgasm in your story? Is it, maybe it won't even be a big one. Maybe there is no orgasm. I do like exploring storytelling in general from that kind of arousal model. But it's always just so interesting to have someone, toss out narrative structures like that as if they are the only one and the only way. And probably had I not already been involved in a lot of sex positive harm reduction kind of ideas with that, like I'd already learned to challenge that when I'd met it in other places. And then when I came to horror, I was like, this is another example of how, we have this like, cis heteronormative hegemony. Let's play with it and let's look at it otherwise. It's so juicy to say there could be more. And that when we watch a film, we might want to try to say we're experiencing it in terms of like a separation of mind and body, but horror, because it is so visceral, we are watching it with our bodies. What does it mean if you jump out of your seat?
Or out of your brain. Skin.
You're under your skin, all of the things that we use to describe it. When we get the creepy crawlies up our back, or the hair rises, those are all visceral body responses. So our bodies are super involved when we watch horror, and there's certainly a lot of body stuff, because it's I think the original horrifying thing is that we live in these bodies and they are not under our control, and they do all kinds of things. Death itself is a body process, and we could say all horror is ultimately the fear of death. And so the fact that we are living perhaps, in the thing that carries us through life, but it could also be the very source of our pain, our suffering, and our own death. How do we, reconcile mind and body? How do we reconcile our own mortality? And that is our body. So all kinds of people have dealt with that in so many ways.
Yeah, and I think like where that brings my mind, given my background, is about bodies like having a female body, having a female physiology, having a vulva, like, what we would call female genitalia, vulva, vagina, uterus, ovaries, those things, and how, it's not a new concept, but having this kind of body, we're sexualized as objects. Generally, everyone can be objectified, but there is like obviously a different thing there. So one, like people viewing you, so an outside like viewpoint of like you're just existing, but the world around you is reacting to you in a way that you find horrifying or you don't understand. And because you don't understand, it's scary. And then also things like having a period or getting pregnant, and especially pregnancy when you don't want it, and maybe not understanding fully how do I become pregnant or what causes pregnancy. And then once you're pregnant, it's like, that's a whole other thing of like, how can I, if you're trying to end the pregnancy, We have a lot of like social ideas around how abortion is wrong or taboo, which is a recent phenomenon, which we won't get into right now, but just to say that. But pregnancy itself is kind of a horror show.
Yes,
you know,
it is.
it's as you know personally, right? Your body is changing in these drastic, crazy ways. There is something inside of you that is, you know, technically like not you, but made of you. It's rather horrifying. So this idea and often like that feeling too of if you get unexpectedly pregnant, unwantedly pregnant, that your body has betrayed you. Whereas like, you know, from the perspective I'd like to take is your body is just doing what it's gonna do. You assign what you feel about that. But the other thing that I'll say, I've never watched American Horror Story because I'm afraid I'm not going to watch it. But I was at a Planned Parenthood event a few years ago, and there was a woman who I think does critique of horror. And she does like she was a scholar doing critique of like movies of abortion depicted in television and film. And maybe you're familiar with this episode, but there is apparently an episode in which a woman is locked in an insane asylum. And she becomes pregnant, or she either arrives pregnant or she's raped and gets pregnant, and she's trying to abort the fetus and it doesn't work. And so like the whole, from my understanding of this episode, and again, if you've seen it, please clarify, it's just this horror of your body doing a thing that you can't prevent it from doing. And you're you're being ineffectual at doing something about it when you try.
Despite being a horror fan, I have not seen American Horror Story, but I am familiar with like the way that, we have through a deliberate modern, I agree, campaign, we put a fear narrative and an out of control narrative. Those are all stories that we have told about our reproductive systems. You know, and it is interesting how it appears and how it is always done as like a scary thing. One of the, you know, as we face this moment in history and reproductive politics is that in many ways we have to bust those fear stories because people aren't actually thinking about what abortion is on any material or practical level. They think abortion like a boogeyman. And, you know, how much you have to sit there and say, you're looking at a lot of special effects. You're looking at a lot of like contrived storytelling devices that are designed to manipulate an emotional experience from you. And we have let that storytelling fall like really predominantly into one set of hands, you know, in mainstream media, just in general. Like, why do we always have to make abortion like, like you can almost hear the thunderclap behind it. That abortion can never exist in a neutral way or, you know, heaven forfend a positive way. But,
or like, no, everyone doesn't die. Like there's all these depictions of abortion in films where like you get the abortion and then you die horribly. Like there's like, or like there's this TV series Sci-Fi did that's called The Magicians, and they really loved it. And I think it does fall into the horror category maybe in some ways, but there's this whole thing where this person becomes pregnant unwantedly through rape with a demon spawn, and she's like trying to abort the fetus. And you think like they're witches, they would have like there's some questions I have about that. Like you would be able to deal with this, like you would have some spells for this situation.
Witches would be ready.
You'd be fine. This is not a storyline that would exist, but it's like, you know, given this time, and every time she tries to like get rid of the pregnancy, have an abortion, like the fetus reacts and like starts like stabbing people, or like compels other people to stab people. And I was like, this is just silly, but to that point.
Or even the way that the pro-life has been releasing, like Lobby did a small YouTube, and I'm just going to call it's a shock horror film of a misoprostol medication abortion. And it was floating around, and they really do it like a horror film. It has all the conventions of the way the camera angles are working. And because I had a horror lens, I was like, oh, they're picking the like top 5 things that you're in a horror film for in terms of the lighting palette, the camera angles, the music. You know, I just immediately knew what they were doing, and they did it as a complete gore horror shock. Like the nurse is counting cash for the abortion pills and hands them over, and they cause these like you just over the top horror film cramping and bleeding, like blood everywhere, you know. And it's so over the top, and it's designed to scare people as much as possible from medication abortion. And it's like creates this just mess for activists who have to come and clean up because they've released a horror film, not a documentary. but people are having very strong emotional reactions to it. There's the need to be, honest and medically accurate to say, well, there's not going to be that much blood. That's The Shining that you're seeing. There's not even that much blood in a human body, let alone from a basic medication abortion. But there is going to be blood, and this is what the clotting will look like, and that will have a material presence to engage with. So you have to be prepared for it. So the answer isn't there is no blood. So how to talk about it accurate. So it's always, it's frustrating at how media literacy can be like so necessary, and it's something that just isn't taught the same way. That media literacy helps us cut through the bullshit of propaganda, and to say this is a movie and you probably should have entered it in Fangoria rather than saying, this is an abortion documentary. We should define the media accurately.
Right, which is like
well,
the same point being like, again, with pornography of like, this is not sex ed. This is not what sex looks like. Ugh. And you're like, yeah, it's porn. It's entertainment. It's not a documentary on how you should be having sex, or like, you just arrive to the scene and you go full penetration, no condoms, no lube. Like, here we are. Right. Similar parallels. So with that, I'm wondering like more, other body horror things. So that's like one of the obvious ones, I think, in this particular lens. But what else have you found that you've like really enjoyed from your particular lens when it comes to the genre of like body horror specifically?
And I like really, because body horror was something I wanted to photograph well, and so there were so many that I love that I didn't talk about. Alien is one of the greatest, I think, horror films ever made, and that's a reproductive horror. Last Halloween, actually, when I was, brand new postpartum parent, we had a family costume where I dressed as Ripley and I had a little orange cat I stitched on my suit. My partner dressed up as one of the other crew members of the Nostromo, and my baby was the little alien, which was a fantastic costume. So I have so much love for that film. And that is body horror, really, just in so many ways. It's the horror of pregnancy. I think the face hugger actually is so accurate about what a placenta is and what a placenta does. The horror of the placenta. We have the most aggressive placenta of the animal kingdom in terms of how far it burrows into the uterus. Like, it's deeper than any other mammal, and it has this very interesting way that it's mediating nutrition. And so the placenta is very much the guardian angel of the fetus, and not necessarily the person who is carrying that pregnancy. The placenta is looking out for one person and one person only.
Which is like a really good point about pregnancy too. It's like, people who study pregnancy and from a, scientific perspective are like, the mother and the baby aren't necessarily on the same page, right? So like, even again, going back to abortion, which we'll continue to go back to, I'm sure, but this idea of like, well, as soon as you conceive a baby, of course, everything you do must be for that baby, but that's really not how it works, like, biologically. And you have different goals. You have different goals. Like, you're, as the host or the mother, your goals and your needs for self-preservation are very different than, the parasite growing inside you.
Yes. And that's also, that's interesting part, because like, we do have this, perhaps we put people off on the wrong foot when we have this, like, mother and baby are on the same page and they know, and like, you're all like synced up. And it's like, that's not true at any point in a relationship with our parents or our children. Like, at what point are we ever really 100% on the same page? And we share maybe the same meta goals. There's similar survival goals. There's, we learn to work together, because being antagonistic obviously is no good for anybody in the unit, but there is a natural amount of friction in all of those relationships. So when we start saying like there was this perfect harmony, like that's like saying there was Eden and then, there's birth and it ended. Like, that's not true. It's it was always nuanced and complicated, and, it influenced by so many different, it's so multivariable. There's so many factors that, again, you can't just put one single narrative on it. You do great injustice to the infinite diversity of the human experience to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is, when you can get into more of the nuances of horror as opposed to just like, it's blood and people are dying. It is, I mean, that's why we have horror. And I think you, in another post, you talked about how tragedy is the original horror. So when we just have like comedy and tragedy, horror and tragedy are the same thing in many ways, because if you think about themes of tragedies, right, like people get murdered horribly, there's like a ghost haunting you, like let's think about Hamlet, right, like Hamlet like is a horror show.
Horror show,
like
everyone's dying. Titus Andronicus is a slasher movie. Like a lot of you, like if you really like, and you go back to the ancients, you know, they're not just strumming lutes and looking somber and like quoting the boring parts of Plato. You know, they're really, there's monsters, and sometimes our heroes get eaten.
Yeah,
bad things happen. Sometimes not everybody gets married. Sometimes everybody gets eaten.
Right. Or like thinking about the Odyssey, Homer, anything like that. Yeah, terrifying.
Terrifying.
Yeah.
Like, the stories of the gods, you know, are like eating, you know, we're talking about like acrimonious relationships. Like there are gods who eat their children, and that becomes the, you know, mythology foundation of that kind of thing. You know, all these stories have so much horror. And I think playing with the horror is something that we do, you know, even as small children. When I think about some of the earliest role plays that you do as a kid or even as a toddler, is how much do little kids love to act out being dead and dying? They like overwhelming, like, you got me.
Yeah.
You know, they're acting out horrifying things because it's so big. How do we wrap our head around it? And we wrap our head around things that horrify us with play. We, you know, sometimes people can use sexuality, people use humor, people use dramatic monologues and soliloquies. You know, historical fiction is dealing with horror, the horrors of war, but it deals with different music and different camera angles and different costumes, but it's still dealing with ideas that are horrifying. It's just different types of aesthetic trappings around it. We use every tool in our psychological arsenal to confront these big, huge issues of birth, of, you know, sex, of death, you know, and of what makes the difference between breath and air. You know, as other, you know, great writers have said, what's the difference between breath and air? And I think that's the central question of a horror film. I think that's sometimes the central question of all art and all media that we make, is to grapple with the life and death issues. So it's one that I find horror to be a fun way to do it. But then at the same time, I also know, because it's symbols, sometimes you get so battered with it in a horror film that you're like, I get it.
Right. Yeah. Well, so with that, I guess before, you know, as we working our way towards the end of this hour, I would love, again, like going back to that at the top, I want to talk about different kinds of killings in horror movies. So like, you know, classic movies, thinking of like Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street, which I really actually enjoyed. Nightmare, I mean, it was terrifying, but I love that concept of like, there's no escape for you because you have to fall asleep, right? So like, again, body horror, I think, plays a role in there. But you mentioned in one of your posts this concept of penetrative versus castrative killings. And so I'd love to hear more about that. And then like anything else you want to add to that part of the conversation.
Yeah. Well, this is the whole idea of, you know, horror films, the bad guys killed by stabbing or chopping. Really, that's it. And that's how you know we've entered the world of symbolism, because most homicide, you know, in our society is guns. It's gun deaths. And that's actually like really the horrifying thing that we have to deal with. And, you know, what do we deal with this weapon situation? But horror films, you know, like Freddy Krueger does not show up with a gun. You know, Jason has a machete, not a gun. Like, nobody has a gun. That's not what they're doing. And that would be so unsatisfying for us to watch. And so that lets us know, like, why is that unsatisfying? You know, that's the interesting question. And that's dealing with the issues of sexual tension. But, you know, all of these weapons, even though sometimes there's other creative kills that might be orchestrated through different types of, you know, Rube Goldberg machines or chains of events, you know, usually it breaks down to going back to those very, very basic reproductive metaphors, of the stabbing, you know, which would be the penetrative type of death, or the castrative, which would be like the chainsaw or the chopping, you know, or going back to the whole concept of the Freudian castration anxiety, or just the fear of the vulva in general. There was a group of feminist horror critics who called their I think their podcast or whatever their project was, but they called it Axe Wound, which is of course another like for the cunt or the pussy, the
or
axe
gash,
wound.
right? We call it gash. It's a really gross term.
Or the concept of this, the bleeding, or that horrible, stupid old joke that we all heard in 3rd grade, like never trust something that bleeds for a week and doesn't die, which is a horror joke, right? That's a body horror joke. So it has like all of those anxieties with it, and just these deeply sexually repressed characters. To go back to the idea of the final girl, we often have the idea that it's, she's rewarded for her virginity. But then when I consider what a slut shaming culture we live in, and in the Men, Women, and Chainsaws is the reference to The Interview from the creator of Halloween, about how he saw in his film that it was the 2 most sexually repressed characters who are the most violent. And that you have all these other kind of people in the background, and they're hooking up, and we think that they're being punished for doing something wrong. But maybe that shows that we're empathizing with the perspective of the killer. If we're starting to put that morality on, whoa, wait a minute, what if these are just actually innocent bystanders who have happy, healthy lives? They're having fun. Like they're at, they're at college, they're at a party, they're not doing anything wrong. And this disruptive force of shame and this disruptive force of sexual repression is actually what the villain is. So rather than have it like this kind of like weird morality structure that we put on, maybe the truth is that repression like that is dangerous, and it's hard to deal with, and we need to get the ideas of sexuality out in the open, so people aren't, overburdened by that or, destroyed by it, due to that kind of shame and internalized like marginalization or internalized oppression.
Absolutely. And I think, it reminds me of like events that have happened in real life. So, a few years ago where there was that man who went and like killed shot a bunch of girls because no one would have sex with him. And he felt like he was being personally attacked because he wasn't able to access sex in the way that he believed he should.
Yeah. The entitlement, the being dispensed or owed or due, which is interesting because that's like a narrative that doesn't even come out of horror. Like that's what comes out of even our Disney fairy tales, is that male heroes do a great thing and their reward is the maiden.
Yeah.
Whether she likes it or not, like I killed the dragon, so I get my reward, right? Which is going to be, like the assumed sex trafficking of heroic acts. But that narrative, it really doesn't necessarily come from horror. That comes from like a lot of our romance, and it comes from a lot of our comedy, and it comes from, other forms of really patriarchal media. Horror is very in your face. And I'm not saying that horror is because it's not inherently feminist. Just because you can do a feminist analysis of horror does not mean it is produced to like dismantle the patriarchy. It's meant to entertain. That's all that same with porn. Like porn, we can do a feminist analysis of porn, but like pornography is rarely an actual like strategized political attempt to dismantle patriarchy. It's entertainment.
It's a great point.
Maybe I thought like I lose it, but like oh god, now I totally lost it. You have to walk me back. But like again, like just the movie itself, I don't have to say, we want sometimes our media to be feminist, or we want our media to be doing the political work for us. And sometimes it's explaining things, or it's putting concepts in front of our face that allow us to do different kinds of analysis. And that sometimes I think to even look at industries that can function in really oppressive ways, and to pick that art apart, and then to go and create and produce more, because it helps us better understand, where we're standing in terms of like this oppressive society. How do we understand the nature of this oppression, and how do we strategize a way out of it? And art is such an incredible tool that allows us to do that. It allows us to articulate who these monsters are. And I think the whole point of feminist analysis of horror is that it is our duty to midwife the monster, to bring the monster out, midwife the monster, because the monster is giving us so much information. And, you still sometimes have to have that same care and work of midwifery, even though the product is going to be something that has a different purpose.
Right.
But the monster has something to show us. The monster has to tell us what we're afraid of, and the monster lets us do our shadow work. So that's why I do my feminist horror analysis, is to midwife monsters.
I love that. I love that so much. It's such a great way to say that. And also, just thinking about this idea of midwifing the monster and understanding what we're afraid of, going to your original phrase, which is I'm afraid of X. And even being said, even if these films are being created from a cis hetero white male perspective, there is this inherent fear that of sexuality that plays a role. There's an inherent fear of the body. And so, creating a feminist critique of that, and then also looking at that in a way that these are unifying, in some cases, human experiences, some parts, right? You can make that argument. But it's really, it's all just very fascinating. And it's a very much, we repeat, again, these themes are repeated over and over, I think, because of the idea that they're universal and we keep grappling with them, regardless of, looking at the pod people, which I've never seen, but that idea of everyone around, I believe, right? Everyone around you is replaced by you. You have they seem like they're the same, but they're different. And that fear of all of a sudden you look around you and you don't relate to your surroundings anymore. The idea of your body betraying you, the horrors of living and dying, the inherent parts of being human and knowing that war is a part of us, that knowing that we kill each other for stupid reasons and with no good reasons oftentimes. And that's the reality. So how do you deal with that? And again, this concept, being someone I was always fascinated by the mythology or the symbolism of fairy tales, and thinking fairy tales are just for little kids and they help you understand the world around you. But in many cases, and it's not just horror, but because horror is kind of dealing with the things that we're afraid to look at, but making us look at it, again, shadow work. It's, fairy tales for adults, because even if it's not explicitly literal, there's a lot of themes that happen in horror that, that help us to process things we might be feeling internally.
Yeah. And they allow us to feel something, and we get to kind of determine, and I guess this is all where horror becomes a body experience. But in horror, all the characters get to have a moment where they're afraid. And that's a very vulnerable thing. And we kind of have these very gendered ideas of who's allowed to be afraid and why, and whose fear is real and whose fear is respectable, based off of who is impacted by it. But, it is a genre that, in many ways allows everybody to get to that and recognize we're not always confident. Sometimes we do falter, that we are going to face things that are difficult or going to call so much from us to face. But just because, in a comedy film, it's about how, we're all kind of together and cool. Horror lets everyone be shivering and terrified at some point. And I like that opportunity and that chance for everyone to experience that full palette of human emotion. And the way the horror films kind of show that they titrate it, where some people can get there and that's their gift, and other people, because they're so in denial of being afraid, they can't even acknowledge they're in trouble. And that instruction of it's okay to be vulnerable and it's okay to admit that something is scary, and that awareness actually is very key. If you were just, going in overconfident, you may not see that big giant monster who's right there about to eat you, just open your eyes. That's a lesson. That's a lesson for us about coming out thinking, we got it all under control,
Yeah. Or
maybe not.
Or refusing to look at it, being there is a monster here. There's to your point, there's the one token character who has some kind of special outsider perspective, be it even a child, right? They're not an adult, they're a child. There is a ghost here. I am seeing dead people. I see dead people, and no one else is acknowledging this.
No one else is acknowledging the wisdom of my insight, and no one else is, because of how adults we buy into scripts. And we forget that sometimes we let the script speak louder than the reality that we're looking at. And so those characters are oftentimes they're more, aware of what's happening than what the social instructions are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
And and that
absolutely.
there's so much horror, but like we're coming up on like going overtime. But one of the like the trends that I noticed is that as far as my personal preference, like as much as I can sit through like some very harsh and gritty horror, my love has always been campy horror. Whenever
Tell
there's
me
a
more
wink
about
and a
that.
nod, it definitely, it's friendly. And then I realized also with porn, and it's something that I miss in its evolution, is that porn used to be so campy that we didn't have the same questions of consent, because the camp like script made you like so welcome, like you're so aware that you with people who are acting and clearly consenting to be here, because no one pays for a pizza like that. That's not how pizza, that is not how like this plumbing dialogue. And so it reassures me of like we're working with symbolism and we're all here to have fun today. And when horror does that same kind of wink and nod, and the monster is doing that same cheesy thing, I can work with the horror, and I can basically, like, in many ways, like trust the storyteller to not necessarily expose me to something that's going to make me question the reality of it, the way that sometimes other films can, where it's like and I've worked in the industry, but sometimes it can be really hard for me to watch a film when I don't really know if I'm watching reality or not. And that question can really take me out of the experience to some pretty negative places. And I can feel that same way about horror. So a lot of the films that I, suggested, they were on the side of camp, and they're ones that you can watch that shouldn't, maybe the ideas might stick with you a little bit longer, but they're the kind that they don't necessarily follow you home. Those are monsters that are able to really stay at the party, and you don't have to worry too much about their relative realness. Because Freddy Krueger is less scary to me than Forensic Files. Than the horror of actual gender-based violence in our society, which makes me want to weep. Like, I don't like that. That to me is something that becomes so hard, that we are capable of such cruelty. And so I can't really get behind true crime the same way. That just, it can really wreck me to watch that and to be like, that was someone's, like, that person was loved. They were missed. They had their humanity. Like that can bother me. Whereas like Freddy Krueger, like, I'm aware we're dealing with human psychology. Like there is no, there's no Freddy Krueger. And so I can let Freddy Krueger entertain me. And I can ask the philosophical questions, but like, I have no, like, there's no, like, to me, there are no philosophical questions about like true crime and the nature of that kind of violence. There's only like, it's just pure nihilism. It's brutal. And the best we can do in our society is to better protect people from that kind of violence. So that to me, that's two different things, even though I think they're often muddied together.
Yeah. I mean, I would say with that, like, the reason I can't watch Handmaid's Tale, I read the book, I have not watched the TV show, and might never watch the TV show, simply because, like, I can open a medical textbook, I can open a history of gynecology and be like, I don't need to watch a fictional version. It's like all right here. So it's kind of the inverse of that, where it's like, I don't need the fiction because like I am well aware of the fact.
I agree. I feel that way so much about so many things. So, like with my list, if it was gritty, I tried to say it, or even that's why, like, instead of talking about Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like the original, which is a very gritty, like brutal film to watch. Like Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, like, is not going to scare you. And there were so many films I didn't get to talk about that just weren't scary, that were fun, that talk about having those special qualities. I think The Faculty, which came out in the 90s, was a sleeper film that was not loved the way it should be. And like the way it just, every character is kind of like playing on the opposite of archetypes. It's like taking The Breakfast Club and flipping it inside out. And
I can't remember if I ever watched it, but I was very obsessed with Elijah Wood, and it was, maybe I watched it, I can't remember now, but it was definitely on my list, and it's like, ooh, am I able to watch it? But like very obsessed with Elijah Wood. But yeah, so like, what are, as we like, we have time, we can do whatever we want. We're doing whatever we want, but I want to be respectful of your time. So as we wind down, these are my last two questions. What is your favorite horror movie, either of the ones that you presented, or just like in general? Like if you had to like pick a top fave, what is that? And then 2, what's your favorite killing and why?
Hard question. I did not cover it, probably because, like, to me, I still think it's one of the greatest horror films, but the original Stepford Wives is my favorite horror film. And it's one that actually makes me uneasy for like days. I almost want to have a nightlight after I watch The Stepford Wives about I mean, it's a great feminist text. It's by the author, the person who brought Rosemary's Baby. So it's a different take on the way patriarchy kind of destroys the individuality of women, and to watch that character as she starts to be aware of what's going on in her community. And there's, you know, a side character, and it just, oh, it's devastating. To me, the end of that film is like devastating. I watch it, I'm like, it's so well acted. The script is great. This is fantastic. Ooh. I can't sleep. I don't trust a single man in my life. I'm ready to like just go make art, you know, in a feminist separatist community. So that is just one of my favorite horror films. You know, another favorite that I make people watch that I didn't get to cover in the series is Anaconda. And Anaconda is a 90s film. I have such like a deep analysis of it. I have just absolutely tortured my friends. I make them watch it with me, and I point out why it's one of the most underrated horror films. And it captures so much about the horror of colonization. And I love that it subverts so many rules. The fact that, like, you know, J-Lo and Ice Cube are in it, and spoiler alert, they both live. Rather than having like the people of color killed off first. That is not what's happening in that film. You know, what the way it really is, it's about, yeah, like, don't, you know, if you're going to go and be a colonizer, like, the snake is coming for you. And I love watching it. And for me, it's fun. And again, it's kind of campy. You know, it's got the ridiculous special effects, but it's a movie that's a favorite because, again, it was filmed in my hometown, and I was a like camp counselor when it was filmed, and I was walking by the set. And I was working with like little kids who were probably about 3rd grade age. And we were walking around this place where they were filming, and I had my back turned, and they'd all been chatty. And all of a sudden, like, every one of these kids just got real quiet and just got big eyes with a smile. And they were watching like me very closely. And so I knew something was up. So, you know, I turned around, and right behind me was the head of the Anaconda, the robot that they were using for the filming. And I was like, just right about to back right into it, into the mouth of this giant snake. And so like, I got to do that as, you know, a camp counselor working with little kids, and to see the giant robot head. And I didn't get to see J-Lo, but I got to see the snake. Was really cool. And I was like, you know, I can't wait till this movie comes out. I've got to see this thing that I almost walked into. Right. So again, having that material experience of being able to remember that, you know, there were artists who made this, and, you know, they were, you know, basically like as shadow puppets to entertain us and tell us a story about human behavior and answer the question, is evil something inside of us, or is evil coming from outside of us? And those are also the 2 questions asked in horror. So for me, having that connection, my favorite kills, Johnny Depp, Freddy Krueger, Nightmare on Elm Street. I loved that they did the Johnny Depp scene with all of the blood, and the way that they had the scene. Remind us. So it's like, yeah, he's watching his TV late at night, and he's supposed to stay up. It's like an Orpheus death. He's supposed to stay up to watch over his girlfriend because she's going to go do battle with Freddy Krueger. But he can't. He falls asleep at the wheel, and he gets sucked into the dream world. And so he gets pulled into the TV, and then like he gets spewed out in this just torrent of blood. And the way that they shot it is they had like this rotating room, which is an old, even like much older, you know, effect. And so the whole room rotated in order to get this like blood waterfall. And so I love that it was a mechanical effect. I love that it was such an over the top effect. The fact that studio had the room that could do that you see in a few other films, in order to do that very specific thing with shooting. I always love anything that's got robots or real material effects. I like the analog stuff. CG just doesn't connect with me yet the same way as a robot does. You know, I anthropomorphize matter very easily. So anytime there's a group of people doing that and bringing a monster to life like that, I love it. The bigger the robot, the better. And I love finding out what happens to these things, you know, like from Jaws, Bruce the shark. You know, the shark from Jaws wound up in, you know, like some just junkyard backlot, you know, that it was forgotten in history until
wow.
people rescued it. And, you know, you'd think at the time they would have known that that would have been like an object that someone would want, but that it could just be discarded because its use was over, or, you know, any of those leftover props. I think those are, where did they wind up? Where did they go? Harold and Maude, you know, the film is not really a horror film, but it deals with concepts of death. I don't know if you've ever seen Harold and Maude.
No.
It's a beautiful 70s film by Bud Cort, and it's a beautiful film. It's not a horror film at all, but it's about a young character. He's a young guy. He's very privileged. He's a privileged white male, and he's constantly trying to kill himself in these black comedy kinds of ways to get the attention of his mother. And he crashes funerals for fun, and he accidentally meets this elderly woman named Maude. And she just is a force of life despite being elderly, and he falls in love with her. But it's a very, very wild comedy. But they created this incredible hearse car. Like, the mother of this film just wants her son to be normal, and she gets him a fancy sport car, and it's, you know, it's like a Ferrari or Corvette, and he turns it into a hearse. You know, and so that's like the thrust of this film. And like, oh my God, you know, you watch that film and like, I would love this car. I think anyone who loves cars would want this car. But to shoot the film, they really did drive it off a cliff and crush it. Like, it's gone. So sometimes those mechanical things are that great art. Sometimes they're destroyed, you know, to continue the art, and they're gone. And sometimes they're forgotten and they're discarded. But I like the idea that somewhere it's forgotten in some attic or in some junkyard, there is some beautiful, you know, forgotten monster, and just waiting for someone to find them. And any of them, like, I'd love it. I love it. The creature from the Black Lagoon can come live with me, and I want all of them. I love all the monsters.
That's so great. And I mean, I'm sure there's a metaphor in there too of like discarded horror paraphernalia, right? Like, you know, and like looking at all those things as well. There are so many more things that I'd like to talk to you about, so I'll have to have you back on. Another thing that I wanted to get into, I don't think we have time for, but the concept of harm reduction, and how harm reduction is like, I'm gonna keep talking, but harm reduction is like an antithesis to horror, of where it's like, we're not going, maybe this is the theory I'm coming up with in the moment, but this idea of like, instead of being like, we must succumb to the horror of the experience of addiction, it's like, how can we actually like help you exist in whatever state you're in? How can we, even if it's not addiction, but just like, how can we help reduce the harm, as opposed to being like, lost cause, you're relegated to hell? How can we instead like bring you back to a different way of being instead of like succumbing, which I know is such a big deal for you, harm reduction. So
I would say that horror films take us to the point of hopelessness, and sometimes in the genre they leave us there, but very often in horror, like, there is some form of overcoming it, even if it's like made to be a fake out in the last few minutes of the film. But I would say, like, the characters in many ways, like, they have their special thing that allows them to have a different perspective. They have a special gift, but oftentimes the one thing they do when they face the monster and they defeat it is it winds up being the smallest thing in the room. It's sometimes they come in with the biggest weapon and the biggest plan, but that's not what undoes the monster. It's usually something very, very small, and it's something very accessible, and it was something that was in their reach right away. You know, in many ways, it still has that Wizard of Oz effect, where it's like Dorothy always had the ruby slippers on her feet. And in a horror film, the character does always have that magic gift at their fingertips, and sometimes it's just about them remembering it. And even in the midst of all of the horror and all of the chaos, and everyone is dead and they are the last ones, and that's when they should give up. You know, a horror film, usually it shows us someone who does not give up, no matter what, even when they should, even when logic tells them they should, and everything is telling them they should, they don't. And they find the one positive change they can make in that scene. And very often, like in those climax, we see that one positive change has a massive effect, and it undoes things. Or sometimes the magic of the horror film is that one small thing that has this chain effect, and a monster is freed, because one person is able to identify the little detail in their life that went missing, or oftentimes the way they were unheard, you know, or the point of the unresolved trauma. And, you know, they can't necessarily change that person's entire story, but sometimes, you know, the monster is undone simply by being seen as someone in pain. And to me, that is harm reduction, or that's the power of harm reduction, is even in the midst of all the chaos and all the pain and all the trauma, you take a big breath and you take that next step towards something better or something different. And you don't let the horror be the last word. I think the best horror film, hope, is the final word.
That's amazing. That's like such a perfect encapsulation, I think. And like, again, bringing us back to the current moment, hope and resilience and taking that one little step and like looking at things in a different perspective. 100%. Awesome. You're amazing. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me. This was really fun. And
it was so great. I need you to do a horror movie podcast now, so please do that with all of your free time as a homeschooling parent.
Right. I need to have another project, because again, like, this was just about me trying to get back to being a productive person and to do something that with all the politics, I wanted to look at something different. So, will I do a horror movie podcast? Who knows? But like, I hope that I keep creating, and I hope that everyone else does too. I hope as we're all facing the horror of this moment, and we're like days away from the election. So I know a lot of people are feeling fear, loathing, horror, and very much from that spectrum of the feelings wheel. We're all kind of in that dread area, is to remember that no matter what happens, the only way out of this is to create. Like, we're all going to have to create. We're all going to have to do that together. Now is, like, in many ways a time to sit there and say, like, are there any, do you need to bury the hatchet with anybody that was a good comrade, that you had a personality conflict with, that you need to work with going forward? And that doesn't have to be someone who like hurt you or like a toxic person. But I think a lot of times as we've gone through life, we have people that we've had falling out with. Maybe right now we can't afford to lose those people in our lives. And so if it's comfortable for you, and if it's not, like, this is not like go forgive everybody who was bad in your life. But like, if there's somebody who's in the shallow end of something, I think we can create relationships out of that again. And it now might be the time that we need to do it, because no matter who's elected, we still have a lot of work to do. We still have to come out of a pandemic. We still have to come out of climate change. We still have to come out of a Supreme Court situation. Like, we don't know what the rest of the legislative situation is going to be. Like, there is like, if Biden is elected, we don't get a hero. Like, Biden will not be our ruby slippers. We are our ruby slippers. So
exactly, we are what we have.
We are what we have. So to find that hope in the midst of this, and remember that our creative abilities are tremendous assets to all that we need to do going forward. And so even though I picked something frivolous that wasn't about the politics of the moment, it was about the momentum that I need to survive this political moment. And that I hope that people watching it didn't think that I was necessarily ignoring important issues. I certainly still have been, and I have other forms of social media. But this is what I was doing to get myself through this narrative arc where I feel a great deal of dread.
And art is so important, I think, for all those reasons, right? It doesn't have to be explicitly political or social for it to matter. And art is like how we transform and how we transcend. So again, thank you so much for creating. Thank you for doing the thing. Even when you're like, this doesn't really work, you just like did it. And it was wonderful. And you are a wealth of knowledge. So do you want to like plug anything before we wrap up? Is there anywhere you'd like, we mentioned
right now, let's see. Aside from my little personal like projects, I would say right now, especially in the name of sex worker rights, is to pay attention to the dialogue that you're hearing about Section 230. Especially if you're online, you're using social media. So Section 230 does involve you, and look at the way things like Sesta Fosta and the Earn It Act are going to impact sex workers and their experience and ability to use tools online. Going forward, the Earn It Act is going to kind of erode a lot of digital privacies, and we're going to need digital privacies to talk about reproductive rights. So I would say for all of us, be aware of these bills, be aware of the digital privacies that you're going to need, especially if you're working with abortion access. We might all make sure you got some signal for that. Look into your digital privacy. Be aware of those issues that are going to start to blow up. And then, I'm always like open to have conversations with people. I normally I'm traveling. Normally I wouldn't even be at home in San Francisco. This is the longest I have gone without traveling somewhere to give a talk. And so in many ways, I wish I were plugging a lot of big talks that I would be doing, but there are events that have been canceled. So I have nothing like that particular to share.
That's fine. We'll definitely, I think you need to come back and we need to do some more sex worker rights stuff because, just plugging all that at the end, very important, and also like something that needs its own hour plus to discuss.
Yeah, it's like part of me is like, I should just come up with a reel because I'm like, here are the like organizations I liked, and like, please make sure to stay tuned with Swap USA and Swap Behind Bars.
Yeah,
following with the national organizing efforts around sex worker rights. Swap Behind Bars is a special branch of the Sex Workers Outreach Project that is working with incarcerated sex workers to help them get the resources they need behind bars and upon reentry, to make sure that people feel welcomed home into our community. So I always want to plug those fantastic organizations that I've worked with. And many more, especially in the harm reduction movement. And I will always say that if you are not carrying Narcan yet, you should be. So
what is that?
Harm reduction? Narcan. Oh, naloxone. Oh my goodness. Narcan is a big part of harm reduction. I'm going to do my 30 seconds because I think it's so cool.
Do it.
Naloxone is essentially an antidote to any opioid-based overdose. And so an opioid could be synthetic like fentanyl, or it could be heroin. Or morphine, anything that comes from the opioid family that works with the opioid receptor in the brain. So when someone's having an overdose, their brain and all those receptors have been flooded, the respiratory system starts to shut down. The drug Narcan does one thing and one thing only. It falls madly in love with opioid receptors, and it finds all those opioid receptors. And even if there is an opioid molecule sitting on top, it kicks them off, it interrupts the dance, and it hugs the opioid receptor. And that person's overdose is effectively like reversed. Their breathing is going to start again. It totally just kicks the effects of the opioids out. And it lasts for approximately 30 minutes, which is usually enough time for the rest of the body to metabolize the drug. Sometimes a person might need a second dose because it is time limited. But it has the only side effect all it does is block opioid receptors. So if someone is not having an opioid overdose, it's fine. That medicine will not interfere if something else has caused them to stop breathing. It should be part of everyone's first aid kit. The only reason that it isn't is because of stigma against drug use. Most forms of insurance will cover it. So check your insurance. If you have it, might cover it. If not, a lot of places provide it for free or cheap. If you are low income or unhoused, your local needle exchange will absolutely put it in your hands in any possible form possible. There are other projects that will help you out to negotiate your own insurance or how to pay for it out of pocket. You can learn how to use it with an intramuscular injection or nasal spray. So if you're needle phobic and you don't like needles and you cannot imagine ever giving somebody, a dose of a medication with a syringe in an emergency, that's okay. You can have nasal Narcan and that will do the same thing. Narcan is the brand name. Naloxone is the drug name. I think it's a really important way to be in solidarity with people who use substances or may be at risk for an overdose, especially since right now the drug supply is all contaminated with fentanyl. And we're seeing a lot of people who are experiencing overdose and they thought they were taking ecstasy or they thought they were buying Xanax and instead they were getting fentanyl. So naloxone, Narcan, send me a message if you want to help getting connected to it. Absolutely. I would love to see naloxone in everyone's hand. Carry Narcan, it's great stuff.
I love it. Okay,
you too can be a lifeguard on the river Styx. That's how I describe it, is when you have Narcan, someone is dying and you're going to turn them right back around and you're going to say, it's not your day today. I'm a lifeguard of this river.
I love it. You're a wealth of information. You're going to have to come back. We're going to have to do a whole thing with just that topic. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Maggie. Thank you so much. This was so wonderful. We will do some links in however this results in being out to the public. I will hit you up for those links and we'll have things on both academia, where to go and where to go for your harm reduction supplies, because you are right. That is extremely important. Thank you so much.
Happy Halloween and
happy Halloween, happy Samhain, whatever it is that you celebrate, Day of the Dead, whatever it is, blessed be.
Blessed be. All right. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. Have a great night.